I first used the census in the year 2000. Ooh, 21 years ago. Which at that time, the latest census was 1920. So I just graduated high school. I was in my first year of college. And I wanted to start documenting my family history with official documents. So I went to the Newberry Library, downtown Chicago, where I was encouraged to look at census records. The first thing that I want to tell you is when you're looking at census records, is start with the most recent ancestor. Okay? Now, in my case, I knew my grandmother. I had the names of her parents, her grandparents, and her great grandmother. I had all their names, but I started from the most recent ancestor, and I encourage you to do the same thing. So my grandmother was born March the 16th of 1920 in the Clinton community of Greene County, Alabama. Now, when I pulled up the 1920 census, it was dated as January 2nd, 1920 in the Clinton community. So my grandmother was not born yet, but her mother was in fact 7 months pregnant. Now the census does not always acknowledge when a woman is pregnant, but if you do the math, you can see that she was about 7 months pregnant. So the head of the household was my great-grandfather Henry Rice. He was 45 years old, making his birth date around 1875, and listed was his wife, Mary Elizabeth. She's 35 years old. Now, if you look at the 1920 census and you see all the people in their household, they did their best to acknowledge the proper relationships. I think there were one or two that was not correct, but they pretty much had children before they married each other, and they had grandchildren as well that was currently residing with them. So now that I see Mary on the census and I know that she's married, then I go back 10 years. I go to the 1910 census, to see if I can locate her. Now at that time, I know that Mary was not married to Henry Rice because he was married to another woman and she was back with her parents. Her first husband was named Walter Scott. And apparently he got into some trouble in Alabama and they had to sneak him out in the middle of the night and he went on to Chicago. The plan was for him to send for Grandma Mary and the two children, but he never did. So she moved on and took her maiden name back of Eatman, and she was living with her parents. So in 1910, she's with her parents, her younger siblings, and her two children. So now that you see that she's about 22 years old, now you go 10 years before that, you go to the 1900 census. And she's living in the household with her parents, Henry and Ella Eatman, and she is considered a 12-year-old girl. Now, since there was a fire in 1890 and many records were destroyed, Greene County was left without a trace. So from 1900, you have to go 20 years back to the 1880 census to retrieve some information. Now, in 20 years, that's a big difference. So Henry and Mary, which was my grandmother's grandparents, they were a young married couple. Henry was 24 and Mama Ella was 20 years old, making her birth date 1859. So just based off of her birth date, you know that she was born during antebellum slavery. Now, to go back even further, if I would go back to 1870, Ella would be 10. Now, I would have to know what Ella's maiden name was. And at that time, I didn't know it. And nobody else seemed to know it either. So at this point, that's when you have to get a death certificate.